There is a tension in the ancient world that has never been fully resolved. Two civilizations, two names, two destinies woven into the oldest written record humanity possesses. One is Israel, a nation born not by conquest, not by geography alone, but by covenant. A people chosen, scattered, disciplined, and gathered again. The other is Persia, a land the ancient world knew as mighty, imperial, and proud. The land we call Iran. Their stories do not simply intersect. They are entangled. From the earliest pages of Scripture to the final visions of prophets who saw beyond their own centuries, these two names appear, disappear, and reappear, as if the story between them is not yet finished. This is not a political commentary. This is not a sermon. This is a careful, chronological reading of what the biblical text actually says about Iran, about Israel, and about what the ancient writers believed would ultimately unfold between them. Before Persia was called Persia, it was called Elam. The name appears early in the biblical record, one of the sons of Shem, the son of Noah. Elam settled in the territory east of Babylon, west of the great Persian plateau, south of the Median highlands, a people ancient even by ancient standards. For centuries, Elam was a regional power. It warred with Babylon. It traded across vast distances. It produced archers renowned throughout the known world. The biblical writers knew this land well, and the first sustained prophetic engagement between this region and the God of Israel comes not through a military encounter, but through a declaration. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the years before the Babylonian exile, turns his gaze eastward. He speaks directly into the destiny of Elam. "I will break the bow of Elam," the voice of God declares through him, the finest of their strength. The bow, their finest weapon, their defining instrument of war, the thing they were most known for, and it would be shattered. Jeremiah continues. He speaks of four winds coming from the four corners of heaven, scattering the people of Elam in every direction. A dispersion, a loss of cohesion, a national unraveling. But the passage does not end in destruction. It ends with a breath of restoration. "Yet it shall come to pass in the latter days," the prophet writes, "that I will bring back the captives of Elam." Even in judgment, a future remains. This was not the final word. The centuries moved forward. Babylon rose. Babylon consumed the known world. Jerusalem fell. The temple burned. The people of Israel were carried east, into the very shadow of the lands where Elam had once reigned. And then, something the biblical writers had seen coming happened. From the mountains of the east, from the plateau of Persia, from the highland kingdoms of Media, a new power arose. Isaiah had written of it decades before it occurred. "Go up, O Elam, lay siege, O Media." The imagery is striking. The prophet names the peoples who would topple the empire that had shattered Israel. He describes the fall of Babylon almost like a man watching it unfold from above time. In the 5th century before the Common Era, Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, marched on Babylon. The city fell, and in one of the most extraordinary moments in recorded history, the Persian king issued a decree. The Jewish people, still in exile, were free to go home, not scattered further, not destroyed, sent home. Isaiah had named this man by name more than a century before he was born. "He is my shepherd," the text reads, "and shall perform all my pleasure, who says to Jerusalem, 'You shall be built,' and to the temple, 'Your foundation shall be laid.'" Cyrus, anointed by God, used by God, through the empire of Persia, Nadoriam, the land that the prophecy of Jeremiah had judged. became the instrument of Israel's restoration. This is not a coincidence that the biblical writers treated lightly. It was the architecture of providence. The story does not pause here. The book of Esther is set entirely within the Persian court. A Jewish woman, hidden among the population of the empire, rises to a position of unprecedented influence. And the conflict that forms the center of the narrative is an ancient echo. A man named Haman, an enemy of the Jewish people, who persuades the king to issue a decree of annihilation. The language is extreme, total. The extermination of every Jewish person within the borders of the empire. It was a decree of genocide, and it was issued from within the greatest empire of its age, the Empire of Persia. What follows is one of the most dramatic reversals in the biblical narrative. Esther, at great personal risk, approaches the king. A second decree is issued. The Jewish people are permitted to defend themselves, and they survive. The festival of Purim, still observed to this day, commemorates that survival. The land of Persia, in the same era, produced both the man who would destroy the Jews and the woman who would save them. Both a death decree and a life decree. Both within the same court, both within the same biblical text. The prophet Daniel spent decades in the East. Carried first to Babylon, he lived into the era of Persian dominance. He saw the empire's shift. He recorded visions that seemed to transcend the events immediately before him. In one of those visions, he stands by the river Ulai, in the province of Elam, in Persia. He sees a great ram with two horns, powerful, unstoppable, charging westward, northward, southward. An angel identifies the vision. The ram with two horns is the kings of Media and Persia. The vision is not merely political, it is cosmic. It positions the Medo-Persian Empire within a sequence of world empires that the text believes God himself is orchestrating. And the sequence is moving somewhere. The biblical text does not present history as random. It presents it as directional. Empires rise by pattern. Nations fall by pattern. And within those patterns, certain names recur. Persia and Israel do not simply share centuries of historical proximity. They share a theological thread running through the oldest and newest layers of the prophetic text. After the return from exile, after the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the centuries of Persian prominence gave way to Greek dominance, then Roman. The biblical narrative shifts. Israel moves through conquest after conquest. The temple falls again, dispersion occurs again. But the prophets of the earlier era had already seen further than their immediate moment. Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian exile, long before Persia had reached its full imperial height, records a vision of vast, almost geological scale. He is asked to look toward the north. He sees a coalition, a massive assembly of nations and peoples gathered together and moving as one, led by a figure he calls Gog, from the land of Magog, a prince from the far north. And in the list of nations that march with this figure, among the armies of this great northern coalition, Persia is named, explicitly, without ambiguity. Alongside Ethiopia and Libya and others, Persia appears as a military participant in an end-times alliance directed against a specific target, Israel. But not the Israel of the exile, not a scattered, landless Israel. The vision describes the target with unusual precision, a people regathered from the nations, dwelling securely, living in unwalled villages, prosperous, at rest, occupying the mountains that had once been considered permanently desolate. The prophetic condition of the target is as specific as the coalition itself. This is not Israel in Babylon. This is not Israel under Roman occupation. This is an Israel that has been gathered back to its ancestral land after a long dispersion, living in a condition of relative prosperity, and then confronted by this northern alliance. Ezekiel describes the assault in terms that leave no room for gradual erosion. It comes like a storm, he says, like a cloud covering the land. The nations come with great force, and then the text does something unexpected. God speaks directly into the passage, not through a human king, not through a political intervention. The text describes direct divine action in response to the assault. Earthquake, confusion among the armies, fire and brimstone, pestilence. The coalition turns on itself. The assault does not succeed. And in the aftermath, the text says, the nations will know, not through political triumph, not through military brilliance, but through what they witness, that the God of Israel is real and active and present. This is the theological weight Ezekiel assigns to this moment. Not just a military event, a revelation event, a moment in which the identity and power of God is made manifest on a global scale. The pattern that emerges across these texts is consistent. Persia and its successor peoples appear at critical moments in the biblical timeline, not as background figures, not as passing references, as major actors, as instruments of judgment and instruments of restoration, as enemies and as servants, as the land that sheltered Esther and threatened her people simultaneously, as the empire that freed Israel from Babylon, as the named participant in the final military coalition that Ezekiel saw moving against a regathered Israel. The biblical writers do not simplify this. They hold the complexity. Persia is not simply Israel's enemy. Persia is Israel's ancient counterpart, and the tension between them, across the centuries, is woven into the structure of the prophetic narrative with deliberate and repeated intention. The book of Daniel returns to this geography one final time in a passage of remarkable intensity. Daniel is told that a spiritual figure, a heavenly messenger, was delayed in coming to him for 21 days, not by distance, not by human opposition, but by a spiritual power the text identifies as the Prince of Persia, a territorial being, a dark force associated with the nation itself. The language suggests that the conflict between Israel and Persia is not only geopolitical, it is, in the framework of the text, a conflict with spiritual dimensions that extend beyond the physical realm. The archangel Michael, the text says, is the prince who stands for Israel, and the prince of Persia stands in opposition. Two spiritual powers, two nations, two destinies, locked in a tension that the text presents as ongoing, not yet resolved.
Time is coming.
More than 2,500 years have passed since Ezekiel sat by the river Chebar and received his visions. More than 2,500 years since Daniel stood in the province of Elam and saw the great ram charging across the ancient world. And yet, the names have not disappeared. Israel exists, reconstituted after nearly 2 millennia of dispersion, declared a state in the middle of the 20th century, populated by Jewish people gathered from more than 100 nations. The modern scholars who study the prophetic texts point to that gathering as the fulfillment of the very conditions Ezekiel described before his coalition could arise. Regathered, in the land, dwelling in what were once considered desolate mountains, and Persia. Persia is now called Iran. The geography is the same, the tension is the same. The ancient name appears in contemporary headlines, as if the centuries between Ezekiel's writing and this present moment were simply a holding pattern. Many scholars are careful here. They note the difference between what the text explicitly describes and what modern interpreters project onto current events. The Ezekiel prophecy describes a specific coalition, a specific condition of Israel, a specific scale of assault, and a specific supernatural response. Not every conflict, not every missile exchange, not every political development constitutes the fulfillment of that ancient text. The honest interpreter holds the pattern and the caution simultaneously. What can be said with textual integrity is this: the biblical framework anticipated that these two peoples would remain in conflict, that the land of Persia would not simply fade from prophetic relevance, that the tension between the ancient covenant people and the ancient empire of the East would not quietly resolve itself through diplomacy or distance. The text anticipated ongoing confrontation, and ongoing confrontation is what the record shows. The book of Isaiah, which named Cyrus before he was born and described the fall of Babylon in vivid detail, also contains a passage that speaks of a time when the nations of the earth will be gathered and judged. The language is vast, cosmic in scope, kings and armies and peoples and powers all drawn into a culminating moment of reckoning. The setting in the prophetic vision is connected to the land of Israel. The timeline in the prophetic vision is connected to the completion of a sequence that began with the original covenant. The prophetic structure is not a circle. It is not random movement. It is a line, moving from the beginning of the covenant to its final fulfillment. And every name that appears along that line, Elam, Persia, Media, Magog, and the cities of the ancient world, appears not as accident, but as part of an architecture designed before the events themselves unfolded. What the biblical text says about Iran and Israel, when read carefully and chronologically, is not simple. It is not a single verse. It is not a proof text. It is a sustained, multi-layered, centuries-spanning narrative in which these two peoples occupy opposing but related positions in a story the writers believed was divinely authored. Persia freed Israel. Persia threatened Israel. Persia appears in the final coalition that the prophets describe rising against Israel. And Israel, the covenant people, the prophetic focus of the ancient writers, is described as the nation over whom God himself declares a protective intent. Not because Israel is without flaw, not because Israel is without judgment in the text, but because the covenant made at the beginning, according to the text itself, does not dissolve. I will be their God, the Old Covenant language reads, and they will be my people. That declaration was not issued with an expiration date. The prophets did not write to satisfy curiosity about the future. They wrote because they believed the structure of history was not accidental, that nations rise and fall within a framework of divine intention, that the tension between peoples and powers, the ancient rivalries, and the modern confrontations are not purely the product of human ambition or political calculation. They believed something larger was moving behind the surface of events. The land of Elam will be restored, Jeremiah said. The coalition will rise and will fall, Ezekiel wrote. The regathered people will be confronted and defended, the vision declared. And the nations, all of them, will know. Whether these ancient words describe events still entirely ahead, events currently unfolding in incomplete form, or events misidentified by those too eager to find fulfillment in every headline, that is the question each careful reader must sit with. The text does not give dates. It does not name the year. It does not offer a calendar. It offers a structure, a pattern, a movement. And the names at the center of that movement, Israel and Persia, are still with us, still in tension, still present in the news that arrives every morning. still connected to texts written when the world was young. History moves forward, patterns repeat. The ancient writers believed the story of these two peoples was not random. It was moving, deliberately, towards something. And if the structure of the timeline holds, if the patterns the prophets identified are real, then what we are witnessing between Israel and Iran today is not simply geopolitics. It is the continuation of a very old story that has not yet reached its final page.